Welcome to Lecture 4.4, World War II and the Homefront. In this lecture, I want to talk about the issues on the homefront during World War II. In all, some 16 million Americans served in the armed forces during the war, but many millions more served on the homefront. Now, Stalin said, "The most important thing in this war are machines. The United States is a country of machines, and the United States would produce the machines that would win the war. America had many advantages regarding production in World War II over the Axis powers. In 1938, the last full year of peace, national income in the United States was nearly double the combined national incomes of Germany, Japan, and Italy. American car production, which was an indicator of potential airplane and tank car production in 1937 was 4.8 million cars. In the same year, Germany produced 331,000 cars, and Japan just 26,000 cars. The companies that make the tanks, the airplanes, and the trucks that will win the war were first making cars for civilian consumption. It is also argued that the Great Depression helped America prepare for World War II. In World War I, it was difficult to raise an army and convert factories in an economy that was already fully employed. In the year 1940, after America had suffered through a decade of depression and had almost 9 million workers out of work, and at the time of Pearl Harbor, 3 million men were out of work, America's physical productive capacity also lay unused. The Great Depression, in the words of David M. Kennedy, quote, poised the economy for phenomenally rapid conversion to war production. What was more, the United States commanded virtually self-sufficient continental economy, and the huge American industrial heartland rested safely distant from the threat of invasion or bombing. Now, FDR told Congress in January of 1942, quote, "It will not be sufficient for us and the other United Nations to produce a slightly superior supply of munitions to that of Germany, Japan, and Italy. The superiority of the United Nations in munitions and ships must be overwhelming, a crushing superiority of equipment in any theater of the World War." Now, David M. Kennedy writes, "Thanks to the dispensations of timing and geography, FDR calculated the United States could choose to fight a war of machines rather than men. Substituting material production and technology for manpower had been the essence of the arsenal of democracy or short of war strategy during the neutrality period. Expending motors and metal rather than flesh and blood was the least cost pathway that the Americans could take towards victory. It was the route that would claim the smallest toll in American lives by leaving most of the battlefield fighting to others while Americans toiled in the production line." And that's true. America produces the machines that win the war, while the Soviet Union mostly produces the men that win World War II. They lose a lot of people. Now, the American production model in World War II was to produce quantity over quality. One example of this was the Sherman tank. The American tank in World War II, the Sherman, was small, lightly armored, and a quick tank. It did not have a powerful gun. Against the much better German Tiger and Panther tanks, the Sherman didn't have much of a chance. The Sherman's tanks, the tank's gun could not pierce a Tiger's armor at point-blank range, but the Tiger tank could pierce the Sherman's armor at 4,000 yards. What advantage the Shermans did have were numbers. Some 88,000 Sherman tanks were produced during the war. It was estimated that it would take 5 Shermans to knock out one German Panther. One German tank commander remembered that they defeated every Sherman they fought in battle, but were finally forced to surrender when they ran out of shells. The Americans had more Sherman tanks than the Germans had shells for their tanks. Another example of this was the Liberty ship. Donald Nelson called it the Model T of the seas. Here's a video clip of the Liberty ship that I want you to watch.
America, traditionally a maritime nation, mobilizes its mechanical and its industrial genius to build the largest fleet of cargo ships ever to sail the 7 seas. The method is unique in all the annals of shipbuilding. Ordering prefabricated ready-made parts from some 500 factories scattered throughout the country, the yards apply mass production technique, and the results are breaking all records. Average time to build a ship during the First World War, 11 months. Record time, 7½ months. Now they're completing them in 46 days.
This model is a replica of the Liberty ship, which we built in 4.5 days, and we expect to build many more of them in a shorter time.
The Liberty ship was the workhorse of the American and British merchant fleets. It was 440 feet long and could either hold 300 freight cars, 2,800 jeeps, 440 tanks, 230 million rounds of rifle ammunition, or 3.4 million servings of sea rations. The first Liberty ship, named the Patrick Henry, took 355 days to make. Eventually, using the techniques that Henry Ford used to make his Model Ts, Liberty ships were cranked out with unprecedented speed. In November 1942, workers at the Richmond, California shipyard put together a Liberty ship in exactly 4 days, 15 hours, 26 minutes. In all, some 2,700 Liberty ships were produced. The Richmond shipyard was another tribute to American ingenuity. At this facility, the Liberty ships were built from prefabricated pieces. The Richmond facility was laid out like an American city. There were streets and rail lines that stretched as long as a mile from the assembly sheds to the shore. Huge superstructures of ships inched forward along assembly lines. Parts and components fed into the sheds by overhead conveyors from still more assembly plants beyond. Yet another example was the factory called Willow Run. This was Henry Ford's factory. Henry Ford, by now, he's 78 years old. He contributes to the war effort as well. He built this huge installation southwest of Detroit, and it was nicknamed The Run. Its main building covered 67 acres. It had an assembly line that was a mile long. Charles Lindbergh called The Run, quote, a sort of Grand Canyon of the mechanized world. The plant would eventually produce 8,500 B-24s, the plane that was produced in greater quantity than any other plane during the American War. The B-24 could fly 3,000 miles and had an operational ceiling of 35,000 feet. In total, there were some 2 million workers in the aircraft industry, and they produced 12,600 B-17s, 18,000 B-24s, and 3,700 B-29s during the war. The B-29s would deliver the atomic bombs to Japan in 1945. In 1944, American workers produced 96,000 military and naval aircrafts of all kind. All told, American production was unbelievable. American workers produced 5,700 merchant ships, 1,500 naval vessels, almost 300,000 aircraft, 634,000 jeeps, 88,000 tanks, 11,000 chainsaws, 2.3 million trucks, 15 million rifles and machine guns, 40 billion bullets. To see a comparison, Germany produced just 44,000 tanks and 111,000 aircraft. Japan produced just a handful of tanks and just under 70,000 planes. Another statistic that is mind-boggling is that in the last year and a half of the war in the Pacific, the average Japanese soldier could draw on just 2 pounds of supplies, while the average American soldier could draw on 4 tons. Now, there were a number of agencies during the war that had the goal of guiding the economy towards war production, but the most important agency was the War Production Board. It was established in January of 1942. In theory, the WPB was to be a commanding super agency, kind of loosely modeled on the War Industries Board of World War I. It was headed by the former Sears Roebuck executive Donald Nelson. The WPB awarded defense contracts, allocated scarce resources for military use, and persuaded businesses to convert to military production. For example, they gave tax write-offs to the Ford and General Motors Company in order to convert their factories from car production to tank production. In other instances, the government guaranteed profits to corporations by approving cost-plus contracts instead of requiring bidding by multiple corporations and then selecting the lowest bidder. The very largest corporation in America, including Ford, U.S. Steel, General Electric, DuPont, and General Motors, reaped the largest share of military contracts. More than 2/3 of the prime military contracts went to just 100 firms. The 33 largest corporations accounted for half of all military contracting. This caused corporate war profits to grow from $6.4 billion in 1940 to nearly $11 billion in 1944. But this didn't bother most Americans. They were focused on winning the war. As Secretary of War Henry Stimson said, quote, "If you are going to try to go to war or to prepare for war in a capitalist country, you have got to let business make money out of the process or business won't work." There were some elements of command and coercion, but the government mostly relied on voluntary methods, tax inducements, financial enticements, and market mechanisms to kind of get business on board with the war effort. One of the biggest projects during the war was the Manhattan Project. Before World War II started, many physicists had been studying whether or not the power of the atom could be harnessed. By the 1930s, scientists knew that the nuclei of atoms could be split into smaller particles in a process called fission. They also theorized that the fission of highly processed uranium would produce a chain reaction and unleash untold amounts of energy. In 1942, Enrico Fermi and Leo Szilard, they were scientists who had fled Italy and Germany. They produced the first chain reaction. Albert Einstein, who had also fled Germany and was working at Princeton, with the help of those two, he wrote a letter to FDR and convinced him to develop an atomic weapon. The Manhattan Project, as it was called, was led by General Leslie Graves and the scientist J. Robert Oppenheimer. They assembled a bomb and successfully tested it on July 16, 1945 in Los Alamos, New Mexico. Before it was all over, the Manhattan Project consumed more than $2 billion. It employed 150,000 people, and it required a mess of machinery, plant, and other resources that were available nowhere but in America. World War II also radically changed the tax system in America. The Revenue Act of 1942 provided for some $7 billion in new individual taxes. This was a near doubling of the federal tax burden. Now, prior to World War II, no more than 4 million Americans had been required to file tax returns. All those with incomes below the basic exemption level of $1,500 had paid nothing. Depending on marital status and family status, those with incomes of up to $4,000, and at this time 70% of households fell below that level. So those with incomes up to $4,000 had been liable to federal income taxation, but at a rate no higher than 4%. Because of World War II, that changed. The personal exemption was lowered to $624 in the 1942 law, and that brought in 13 million new taxpayers. By war's end, 42.6 million Americans paid personal income taxes at rates ranging from 6% all the way up to 94%. In the aggregate, individuals now paid for the first time in American history more in income taxes than did corporations. As of 1943, Americans paid taxes at work thanks to the new withholding system, whereby employers became tax collectors and deducted taxes from paychecks. So every paycheck you get, when you see your taxes taken out, that's thanks to World War II. This was another feature of wartime tax that became a permanent part of America's taxpayer culture. Now, in all, World War II cost the American people about $304 billion. About 45% of that was paid by taxation. The rest was paid through borrowing. The American government sold bonds to support the war effort. So that's how they raised the money. Now, there was a lot of rationing in World War II. Thanks to the war, many Americans had a steady job for the first time in a long time. You know, we had the Great Depression previously, and many of those jobs paid well. Now, despite having more money, there were limits on what they could buy. Things such as meat, butter, coffee, tires, and gasoline were rationed. The War Production Board, in an effort to save on fabrics, banned such items as double-breasted suits, vests, trouser cuffs, and patch pockets for men. Pleated skirts disappeared, hemlines went up. The War Production Board also restricted new private home construction in 1942 and prohibited the manufacture of automobiles for private use. Now, despite all this rationing, Americans could spend their money on other things. Americans went to the movies and restaurants. Those are things you wouldn't have done during the Great Depression. They bought books, recordings, cosmetics, pharmaceuticals, jewelry, and liquor in record volumes. On December 7, 1944, Macy's department store had their single greatest day of sales in the company's history. American consumer purchases went up by 12% during the war, while in Germany and Japan it fell by 20 and 26% respectively. America is kind of the only major nation where consumer purchases go up. Everyone else was struggling just to kind of make ends meet. Now, Hollywood supported the war effort. They made patriotic movies, they made newsreels, they sold war bonds, and they entertained troops. The director Frank Capra, whose most famous movies included It's a Wonderful Life and Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, he made a series of films that sought to explain America's war aims to its soldiers. It was called Why We Fight. Movie stars such as John Wayne, Anthony Quinn, and Spencer Tracy portrayed the heroic efforts of American soldiers in many films. The movie Casablanca, about an American citizen in Nazi-controlled North Africa, and Since You Went Away, a movie about an American soldier's wife who took a job in the defense industry. These films showed the patriotism of average Americans. Other movie stars such as Jimmy Stewart actually joined the armed forces and fought in the war. One of my personal favorites from the war is Spike Jonze' Der Fuhrer's Face. And I want you to watch this little song he did.
Ladies and gentlemen, the Fuhrer's face. And is it red? Because this tune is sweeping the country and everybody's out jeering at him. Okay.
When the Führer says, here's the battery, we Heil! Heil! Right in the Führer's face, not to love the Führer. He's a great disgrace, so we Heil! Heil! Right in the Führer's face.
Beautiful.
When Herr Goebbels says, we own the world in space, we Heil! Heil! Right in Herr Goebbels' face. When Herr Göring says, they'll never bomb this place, we Heil! Heil! Right in Herr Göring's face. Are we not the Superman? Hey, pure Superman.
Yeah, we is the Superman. Super duper Superman.
Is this Nazi land so good? Would you leave it if you could?
Yeah, this Nazi land is good. We would leave it if we could.
We bring the world to order. Heil Hitler's world to order. Every one of foreign race will love the Führer's face when we bring to the world disorder. When the Führer says, here's the master race, we Heil! Heil! And in the Führer's face, not to love the Führer is a great disgrace, so we Heil! Heil! And in the Führer's face, when the Führer says, we is the master race, we Heil! Heil! And in the Führer's face, not to love the Führer is a great disgrace, so we Heil! Heil! Right in the Führer's face.
Now, it will be remembered that in 1937 there was a wave of massive labor strikes. There were also some massive labor strikes in 1941. Some 2 million workers staged more than 4,000 strikes throughout the country. But this was all before Pearl Harbor. After Pearl Harbor, this changed. All the major union leaders announced a no-strike pledge after the Pearl Harbor attack, so they promised not to go on strike during the war. FDR did his best to balance his need for labor support with the nation's need for smooth relations between employers and employees. Labor's big fear was that prices would rise during the war, but their no-strike pledge would limit their ability to negotiate for wage increases. The government did its best to address labor's fears. They capped prices to fight inflation. They allowed for a 15% wage increase in 1942, and they supported something called the Maintenance of Membership Rule, which provided that in any place of employment already covered by a union contract, all new employees would automatically be enrolled in the union unless they requested not to be in the first 15 days of their employment. There was one infamous incident where the president of Montgomery Ward, Sewell L. Avery, he refused to go along with the Maintenance of Membership Rule. FDR's Attorney General Francis Biddle entered his office on April 27, 1944, and had federal troops eject Avery out of his office. Biddle then seized control of the company. As he was being forced out of his office, Avery shouted, "To hell with the government," and then he looked at Biddle and shouted, "You new dealer." That's kind of the worst curse he could think of, was to call him a new dealer. So as a result of this rule and FDR's willingness to enforce it, union membership went up from 10 million to 15 million over the course of the war. Now, there were some setbacks for labor. John L. Lewis did lead a coal strike during the war. This happened in 1943. He wanted a wage increase for his workers. As a result, Congress passed the Smith-Connolly War Labor Disputes Act. It imposed a 30-day cooling-off period for strikes, established penalties for strike leaders, and forbade union contributions to political campaigns in wartime. Now, FDR vetoed this bill because he needs labor's vote in his elections, but Congress overrode his veto. It was very unpopular to go on strike during the war. Most Americans did not support that. Now, one of the most infamous violations of civil liberties during World War II was the internment of Japanese Americans. When the war came, there were 200,000 Japanese Americans living in Hawaii and just 120,000 living in the continental United States. Martial law was declared in Hawaii after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and some Japanese Americans were arrested as suspected spies and saboteurs. Ironically, it was the Japanese Americans on the West Coast who were interred, not those in Hawaii where the attack actually came. Now, since 1935, the United States government had identified through spying that about 2,000 Japanese Americans were security risks. They'd also labeled some 14,000 Germans and Italians as security risks. So the government's not just spying on Japanese, they're also worried about Germans and Italians. Now, in January 1942, the government released a report prepared by Supreme Court Justice Owen J. Roberts. This report alleged there were Japanese Americans in Hawaii who aided the attack on Pearl Harbor. In February of 1942, General John L. DeWitt, he was chief of the Army's Western Defense Command, he officially requested the authority to remove all Japanese from the West Coast. A couple of weeks later, FDR signed Executive Order 9066. That directed the War Department to, quote, prescribe military areas from which any and all persons may be excluded. So this was the Japanese removal or internment executive order. It did not explicitly mention the Japanese, and it did not apply to Japanese Americans outside of the West Coast, but this was used to remove Japanese Americans from the West Coast. The Japanese were at first forbidden from leaving the West Coast. Next, they were ordered to report to assembly centers before they could be permanently sent to relocation centers. Yamamoto Ichihashi, he was a 64-year-old Stanford history professor. He described the facility at Santa Anita as, quote, mentally and morally depressive. Thousands are housed in stables which retain smells of animals. A stable which housed a horse now houses 5 to 6 humans. There is no privacy of any kind. In short, the general conditions are bad and without exaggeration. Eventually, more than 100,000 Japanese were uprooted and sent to some 10 relocation camps, one in Arkansas and the rest in the western interior. They lost their homes, their businesses, and their property. They were often forced to sell them hastily for a fraction of their worth. The relocation centers or concentration camps had barbed wire fencing around them. There was an initial site of 6,000 acres that had barbed wire around it. Within this site, there was another barbed wire enclosing that was some 560 acres. There were guard towers, searchlights, and machine gun installations. The Japanese Americans were forced to live in a 20-foot by 20-foot cabin that was extremely hot in the summer and extremely cold in the winter. Within the camps, the inhabitants organized newspapers, markets, and schools. Japanese Americans could be furloughed from the camps. Some joined the military and served in Italy. Some went and worked as laborers on farms, and some were even furloughed so they could attend college. So it's kind of a weird situation. You know, the government says they're a threat, but then they also let them leave at times to go to college or other things. Now, there were some important Supreme Court cases involving Japanese internment. Nisi Gordon Hirabayashi, he was a student at the University of Washington. He had registered as a conscientious objector, and he challenged internment by refusing to register for evacuation. He turned himself into the FBI and stated that, quote, he wanted to uphold the principles of the Constitution. Another Japanese American, Fred Korematsu, he was a 23-year-old living in San Francisco, the San Francisco Bay Area. He had a job welding, and he had an Italian-American fiancée. Korematsu forged his identification papers. He underwent plastic surgery to change his facial appearance, and he was going to hide out during the war as a Spanish Hawaiian. He changed his name so he was going to pretend not to be Japanese. He was eventually arrested by the police. These two incidents worked their way through the courts and eventually made it to the Supreme Court. In Hirabayashi v. United States in 1943 and Korematsu v. United States in 1944, the Supreme Court did uphold the removal of Japanese Americans from their West Coast on the basis of military necessity. Now, this fear was totally misplaced. There were only a handful of incidents of Japanese attacks against the mainland. In February 1942, an oil refinery near Santa Barbara and the Oregon coast was shelled from a submarine. In September 1942, a single-engine float plane was assembled from a submarine off the Oregon coast, and in two separate incidents, dropped two incendiary bombs in the forest of Oregon. Those are the only direct attacks. Japan also launched some incendiary balloons from Japan and floated across to the United States, but that's basically it. Now, World War II presented some ugly realities and promising possibilities for blacks in America. You know, on the one hand, blacks still face discrimination throughout the United States. The armed forces were segregated, and even when blacks did serve in the military, they were often relegated to menial tasks such as cooking, manual labor, and guard duty. They weren't allowed to really fight. They weren't allowed to be promoted. Blacks faced racism at training centers. Blacks from the North were not used to segregation, but when they joined the military, they had to be segregated according to military rules. Blacks had to deal with a lack of access to recreational facilities on military bases. There were segregated blood plasma supplies. They had to deal with higher rejection rates when they volunteered. Blacks, in addition to facing discrimination in the armed services, also faced discrimination in hiring and sometimes couldn't even get a job in defense industries. 3/4 of blacks still lived in the South where Jim Crow ruled. Despite all this, World War II also presented an opportunity for blacks to demand that out of the war to defeat totalitarianism would come equality in America. So in some ways, World War II kind of maybe is the jumping off board for civil rights movement that's going to come up in the 50s and 60s. Now, in 1944, a Swedish economist named Gunnar Myrdal published a book. It was called The American Dilemma: The Negro Problem in Modern Democracy. He began his research for the book in 1938 by traveling throughout the South. His book was kind of referred to as a secular sermon. It was 2 volumes, 1,500 pages. It described the segregation and discrimination that blacks still faced in America. Now, Myrdal stated in his book that all Americans understood the American creed. What was that creed? It was the values of liberty, equality, justice, and fair opportunity for everybody. But according to Myrdal, unreasoning prejudice had made a mockery of those values. To Myrdal, the American dilemma was the tension between those good values expressed in the Declaration of Independence, but the bad behavior of many Americans towards blacks. Myrdal believed that over time, Americans would gravitate away from that bad behavior towards an acceptance of that creed of equality. So he believes that as the war progresses and as the 1950s and the 60s come along, this will kind of start to fix itself. He might have painted too rosy of a picture of how it would fix itself, but he does believe it will get fixed. Myrdal believed that white discrimination towards blacks was the single most powerful determinant of the terrible condition of American blacks. The instrument of oppression worked according to what he called the principle of cumulation, and this is how it worked. Discrimination forced blacks into the lowest social positions. So they're given the lowest jobs, they're sent to the schools in the South that have the least amount of money and the least qualified teachers or least paid teachers. They're basically kept down through Jim Crow and through segregation. This in turn confirmed the belief in racist whites that blacks were inferior, and this cycle prevented changes in attitudes. Now, Myrdal believed that this cycle could also work in the opposite way. You know, as blacks moved up in social standing, as they went to better schools, as they got better jobs, whites would realize that they were just as equal as them, and attitudes would start to change. So that's kind of his thesis. Now, one of the most famous black leaders who pushed for better treatment was Asa Philip Randolph. He was head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. This was an all-black union of railroad workers. He had been arrested for opposing World War I. Wilson's Attorney General, A. Mitchell Palmer, called him, quote, the most dangerous Negro in America. Now, Randolph planned to use public opinion to help gain better treatment for blacks in the midst of World War II. In September 1940, his union passed a resolution urging the government not to discriminate against blacks in the armed forces. Eleanor Roosevelt was a guest at this meeting, so initially they were focused on the armed forces, ending segregation there. A couple of weeks after this resolution was passed, Randolph and a delegation of blacks met with FDR at the White House. Randolph thought he had a sympathetic ear with FDR. FDR usually, people when they left him thought he agreed with them, but FDR kind of talked to everyone to make them think he was agreeable. So he thought he had a sympathetic ear with FDR, but 2 weeks after the meeting, FDR announced, quote, the policy of the War Department is not to intermingle colored and white enlisted personnel in the same regimental organizations. So FDR says he's not going to end desegregation he's not going to end segregation in the armed forces. As a result of this, Randolph planned to march on Washington to end segregation in the armed forces and to be treated equally in the hiring for defense jobs. By the end of May 1941, some 100,000 blacks were expected to march on Washington, which was supposed to take place in July. FDR convinced Eleanor to write a letter to Randolph to try and stop the march. FDR later sent others to Randolph to convince him it was a mistake. FDR eventually met again with Randolph, but Randolph refused to call off the march. He really stood his ground. Out of this kind of process came FDR's Executive Order 8802. This was issued on June 25, 1941, and it stated, quote, there shall be no discrimination in the employment of workers in defense industries or government because of race, creed, color, or national origin. This executive order also created the Fair Employment Practices Committee. This committee had the power to investigate complaints and take remedial action when someone was discriminated against. The executive order, however, did not desegregate the armed forces like Randolph had wanted. Now, because of this executive order and the war, some 700,000 blacks left the South for industrial jobs in the North and West. Also, by the end of the war, blacks held about 8% of the defense industry jobs. They were about 10% of the population. And before this executive order, they had held only about 3% of defense industry jobs. So this executive order helps kind of even that number out. The number of black civilians in the federal government also tripled to 200,000. FDR also took some other steps. FDR is not really a friend of civil rights. Personally, he probably wasn't opposed to civil rights, but he needs the support of the Democrat Party to get his agenda through, and the Democrat Party is the party of Jim Crow and segregation, so he doesn't want to offend them. So when blacks come to him in the 1930s and 40s and say, will you support anti-lynching laws? He says no, because that would offend the Democrat Party, and I need them to get done what I want, so you guys just have to wait. That's basically what he tells them. But he did take some steps, such as this executive order. He did support efforts by the FEPC to root out discrimination. At one point, he sent federal troops to break a strike on the Philadelphia transit system in 1944. This compelled the hiring of black trolley drivers in Philadelphia. His wife Eleanor also took steps to encourage fair treatment of blacks. There's a great story about Eleanor visiting the Tuskegee Airmen, which was a group of all-black flyers. She visits them in 1941. She went for a flight with Chief Alfred Anderson, and there's a picture of it. Eleanor does stick up for FDR, though. One time she was confronted by another woman who said that Wendell Willkie, FDR's opponent in 1940, had better racial views than FDR, and then Eleanor told this woman that FDR had to be the president of everyone, even the people who treated blacks poorly. If Willkie was president, she said he wouldn't deal with those people any better than FDR had dealt. Now, though blacks found increased opportunities in defense jobs, they were still strictly segregated in the armed forces. At one point, General George C. Marshall when it was suggested that the Army start integration. He said that the U.S. Army could not solve, quote, a social problem that has perplexed the American people throughout the history of this nation. The Army is not a sociological laboratory. There's a very famous incident written up in Yank magazine that kind of tells, I think, sums up the black experience during World War II. There's this guy, Rupert Trimmingham. He's in Arizona, and he's traveling with blacks, and they had to stop in Louisiana, and I'll kind of read you his letter. Okay, so this is to the magazine Yank. He says, "Dear Yank, here is the question that each Negro soldier is asking. What is the Negro soldier fighting for? On whose team are we playing? Myself and 8 other soldiers were on our way from Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, to the hospital here at Fort Huachuca. We had to lay over until the next day for our train. On the next day, we could not purchase a cup of coffee at any of the lunchrooms around here. As you know, old man Jim Crow rules. The only place where we could be served was at the lunchroom at the railroad station, but of course we had to go into the kitchen, so they can't eat in the lunchroom. But that's not all. At 11:30 a.m., about 24 German prisoners of war with 2 American guards came to the station. They entered the lunchroom, sat at the tables, had their meal served, talked, smoked, in fact had quite a swell time. I stood on the outside looking on, and I could not help but ask myself these questions. Are these men sworn enemies of this country? Are they not taught to hate and destroy all democratic governments? Are we not American soldiers sworn to fight for and die if need be for this country? Then why are they treated better than we are? Why are we pushed around like cattle? If we are fighting for the same thing, if we are to die for our country, then why does the government allow such things to go on? Some of the boys are saying that you will not print this letter. I'm saying that you will. Colonel Rupert Trimington." So that kind of sums up, I think, how blacks were treated unfairly in World War II. They provided just as much service as white Americans, but they were not treated fairly. Walter White of the NAACP, he published a book that turned out to have a very prophetic statement, and I want to read it to you. He said, quote, "World War II has immeasurably magnified the Negro's awareness of the disparity between the American profession and practice of democracy. Black soldiers," he predicted, quote, "will return home convicted that whatever betterment of their lot is achieved must come largely from their own effort. They will return determined to use those efforts to the utmost." And that's what will happen in the 1950s and 60s. Blacks themselves will start pushing for their civil rights, and they will start standing up to segregation and Jim Crow and changing the American system. Now, even whites were changing how they thought in 1942. In 1942, there was a poll, and a majority of whites, about 3/5, told pollsters that they believed blacks were content with their lot. In 1944, only a minority of whites thought blacks were now treated fairly, so about 1/4. So as the war goes on, whites also start to tell pollsters that they think blacks are not treated fairly. Now, women also had a unique experience during World War II that they didn't usually have outside of war. During the war, women both worked on the home front and in factories and businesses. They also served in the armed forces. One of the most iconic images from World War II is Rosie the Riveter. During World War II, some 19 million women worked for wages at one point or another. They usually worked as welders, volunteer packers of Red Cross surgical supplies, entertainers for troops. They also served as OPA price monitors, but most women worked in clerical and service jobs during the war, so most women don't have the Rosie the Riveter experience. Most women work in offices, basically. Now, nearly 12 million women had been employed on the eve of Pearl Harbor. 90% of all women workers in 1940 fell into just 10 employment categories, such as domestic servants, teachers, nurses, social workers, and civil service jobs. Women who worked tended to be single, and they left their job when they became married. In 1940, about half of the single women in America were employed, but only 15% of married women were employed, and only 9% of women who were married with children under the age of 6 were employed. When the war started, women answered the call to labor in the factories to provide the weapons that would win the war. When the war began, about 3/4 of all women of working age were in the home. About 2 million women labored in defense industry during the war. Women didn't typically drill rivets like Rosie the Riveter kind of portrays it. Instead, women tended to work as welders, secretaries, and they worked in clerical and service jobs, as I've kind of already mentioned. Now, women participation in the labor force kind of rose throughout World War II. Before the war in 1940, it was about 26%. In 1944, it jumped up to 36%. That's its high mark. But then after the war in 1947, it declined to 28%. After the war was over, many women voluntarily left the workforce. During the 1940s and 50s, women tell public pollsters that they still consider being a mother and a wife and kind of a housewife their most important duty. They tell pollsters this themselves. As the 1960s come along, that kind of starts to change a little bit, but we'll get into that later. Now, women worked in factories, but they also served in the armed forces. About 350,000 women served in those armed forces. 140,000 of them served in the Women Army's Air Corps. 100,000 joined the Naval Waves. That stood for Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. Around 1/3 of the nation's nurses volunteered for duty. That amounted to some 75,000 women, and some of these nurses often served on the front lines close to combat. Around 1,000 women pilots ferried planes and supplies in non-combat areas for the Women's Air Force Service pilots. So women do fly planes all across the United States, flying them to places they need for combat and the supplies that are needed. So that's kind of the home front on World War II.